Hello and welcome to today's online event on the topic of racism and COVID-19. My name is Sabrina Dimitra. I'm AMSSA Settlement and Integration Program Manager, and I will be providing a few webinar technical details before I hand it over to today's speakers. On the next slide, you'll see how you can connect if you have any technical difficulties during today's webinar. If you experience technical difficulties, please contact my colleague Melissa Jayde, AMSSA's Communications and Operation Manager at mjay@amssa.org, and AMSSA spelled AMSSA. Next, please. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through a couple webinar tips and tricks. On the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar platform, you will find a control panel that you can expand or collapse by clicking on the orange arrow, which looks similar to the image posted in the slide. As well, on the next slide, you will see that it is possible to expand the features within the control panel by clicking either on the plus sign symbol or the arrow symbol that is next to the title of each section within that control panel. Depending on your browser version, you will either see a plus sign symbol or that arrow symbol. And by clicking on one of those features, such as here, the question feature, you'll see that it expands and you can look to submit questions. And so on the next slide, I just wanted to mention that there's two possibilities in terms of accessing the webinar audio. You can either listen through your computer's mic and speakers or using the telephone. But please note that long distance charges may apply if you connect to the audio through your phone. And finally, I just wanted to highlight how you can submit questions during today's webinar. So as I mentioned, on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a question box that you need to expand, but we're asking that you look to submit your questions into that box throughout the webinar, and our presenters will be looking to answer your questions at the very end, but it's very helpful for them if you provide your questions throughout the course of your webinar so that they are able to adjust and maybe address your questions and concerns during their presentation. And so I would like to now hand it over to our webinar speakers, Jayde, Roche, and Tyra Erskine, who will be leading us through the content portion of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, AMSSA, and thank you everyone for joining us at the Racism and COVID-19 webinar today. We hope that you're all staying healthy and well. Today's presentation is the first in a series of webinars and workshops on anti-discrimination topics. We would like to begin with our territorial acknowledgement. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territories you reside on, and a way of honoring the First Nation people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land, and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is Indigenous protocol. The languages, cultures, traditions, civil laws of the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit precede colonization. I would like to recognize that I am on Treaty 6 territory, home of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Saulteaux.
I would also like to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 7, which is the territory of the Siksika, the Piikani, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation. Mohkinstsis, named by the Blackfoot where the Bow River meets the Elbow, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
We would like everyone to take a moment to acknowledge where they are. Where are you located? Is it part of the numbered treaties? Whose land are you on? We would also like to take a moment to acknowledge our funders. This webinar is funded by the Human Rights Education and Multiculturalism Fund and is being offered by the Alberta Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies in collaboration with ActionDignity and the Alberta Rural Development Network. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on AAISA's YouTube page as well. All right, now for some introductions. My name is Jayde Roche, and my pronouns are she and her, and I identify myself as multiracial. I am the Program Manager for Rural Immigration with the Alberta Rural Development Network, and I'm currently working on my Master of Arts in Community Engagement. The Alberta Rural Development Network is a nonprofit organization that uses the combined expertise of 9 Albertan post-secondary institutions to support rural development in Alberta and help rural communities grow through research and learning. In this past year, ARDN has launched a rural immigration initiative to help support immigrants and refugees across Alberta. Our goal is to facilitate strategic research and expand access to training and education for rural service providers that serve diverse ethnocultural communities and to help develop capacity while identifying community needs. I would also like to acknowledge the contributions of our colleague Elnaz Azdil to this webinar and the larger anti-discrimination project. Elnaz is a project coordinator with the ARDN and has a passion for design and socially sustainable communities. I will now let my colleague Tyra introduce herself and ActionDignity.
Thanks, Jayde. My name is Tyra Erskine. My pronouns are she, her, and my ethno-racial identity is Jamaican, Scottish, and Cree Métis. I am the program coordinator for the People's Cafe, which stands for Coalition to Advance Fairness and Equity at ActionDignity. ActionDignity is a community-based organization that facilitates the collective voice of Calgary's ethnocultural communities towards full civic participation and integration through collaborative action. ActionDignity embraces and promotes the following values: respect for diversity, equity and social justice, active citizenship and democratic participation, and collaboration. In addition to my program work with ActionDignity, I am also an experienced anti-racism facilitator and have hosted trainings at SATE, Gen YYC, the CCE, Camp Firefly, Calgary Pride, and the Calgary Women's March. I am also a member of CommunityWise's anti-racist organizational change project and authored their anti-racism training manual.
We are now going to go over the objectives for the webinar today. By the end of this webinar, we expect participants to be able to view the COVID-19 pandemic through an anti-racism lens, develop an understanding of current human rights implications of COVID-19, recognize how COVID-19 has been framed in the media, and finally, become familiarized with actions that you can take to support your own mental health and well-being. Now for our webinar outline. We will first go over the accountable space guidelines for this webinar. You will then have our first poll for participants. We'll then move into a brief overview of the COVID-19 pandemic and explore some human rights concerns. Next, I will provide you with some key terms to help guide us through the content and share findings from a recent COVID-19 survey. Tyra will then lead our in-depth discussion on racism and health, where we will explore some response strategies that you can use. Finally, we will both lead you through the self-care and community care section of this webinar and end with a quick mindfulness activity and a closing poll. At the end of this webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask any questions you may have. As this is a rapidly evolving issue, we may not have all the answers, but are happy to connect afterwards to discuss questions or thoughts in greater detail. As mentioned, you can ask your questions at any time during this webinar using the chat feature, and we'll answer them at the end. As I mentioned, before we proceed, we would like to go through our accountable space guidelines, which have been adapted for this webinar from CommunityWise. The link to this guide can also be found in the reference section at the end of the presentation. These accountable space guidelines are not only for today's webinar, but also good practices when engaging in discussion on difficult topics such as racism and discrimination, and can be used as a tool to help keep ourselves mindful and engaged. We begin by acknowledging that everyone is in their own space today, and we encourage you to do what you need to in the space to make yourself comfortable. The first of these guidelines is to respect the space and others. Although we are gathering virtually, please acknowledge that this is a safe space for all participants. We also understand that individuals experience racism in different ways, and it is important to recognize that each experience and viewpoint is valid, even if they differ. Validate experiences rather than lecturing or giving advice, and consider that you do not need to agree with a perspective in order to understand it. The next is to examine your own privilege and be aware of potential power dynamics that you might contribute to within the space, whether in person or virtually. Recognize that we are all in a place of learning. Be open to calling in harmful attitudes as well as open to critical self-reflection. If an individual tells you that something you said was harmful to them, listen and use these situations not to harass or call out, but as a learning experience. And finally, take care of yourself. Think of someone you trust and you can debrief with, and plan to contact them if you need to. It is okay if you need to leave the room at any time during this webinar. We would first like to start with a general poll to get a sense of who is joining us today and your knowledge on today's topic. You should see the poll questions come up on this screen. These questions are you attending this webinar as an individual or member of a group? How up to date do you feel on the COVID-19 situation? And have you observed any racist or xenophobic behavior as a result of COVID-19? We'll give you a few minutes to respond to these questions and then discuss it shortly after. All right, so it looks like we have a really great makeup of diverse attendees at this webinar, and thank you so much for sharing. And so the next question should be up on your screen. How up to date do you feel like you are on the COVID-19 pandemic? So again, we'll give you a couple seconds for that one. So it looks like the majority of participants responded that they are either very up to date or mostly up to date. In the next few slides, we're going to cover some brief information on COVID-19 just to get everyone oriented and again, cover some of the basics. And finally, the last question should be coming up on your screen shortly. Have you observed an increase in racism and xenophobia as a result of COVID-19? So looking at the results from the poll, it is quite alarming to see that many people have observed an increase in racism and xenophobia as a result of the pandemic. For those of you who did answer yes to observing these types of harmful behaviors, We encourage you to think critically about what you observed or heard as we move through the webinar and reflect on those behaviors and actions. For those of you who said unsure or no, we hope our analysis of racism and xenophobia related to COVID-19 will increase your knowledge on the issues and provide you with tools and strategies you can use if you do observe this type of behavior in the future. So, as I mentioned, the next slides will just be on a overview of the pandemic to get us all oriented and help to contextualize our discussion. So what is COVID-19? According to Health Canada, coronaviruses are a large family of viruses. COVID-19 is a new disease that has not been previously identified in humans. Symptoms include cough, fever, difficulty breathing, and the COVID-19 outbreak was declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization. The best ways to prevent the spread of COVID-19 is to wash your hands, practice social distancing, stay home if you feel sick, and follow recommendations from public health officials. We encourage you to visit the Government of Canada website to access up-to-date information and resources related to COVID-19. Now, to better understand the current situation, we have provided a brief timeline of the COVID-19 responses by the Alberta government. We understand that some of you may be joining us from outside of Alberta, and we encourage you to visit your provincial or territorial website for up-to-date information on public health recommendations and guidelines. Each of the provincial or territorial timelines may look different. So starting at the top, the first case in Alberta was reported on March 5th. Closure of schools and daycares in the province happened on March 15th, and on March 17th, the Premier declared a state of public health emergency. On March 27th, the Premier ordered the closure of non-essential businesses, and the province announced further restrictions on mass gatherings. And today, Alberta has continued to implement new restrictions and guidelines to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. On the left of your screen is a poster from the Government of Alberta website that people have been using to share up-to-date factual information on helping to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The dramatic rise in racism and xenophobia related to COVID-19 is especially concerning given the situation is rapidly evolving, as we can observe from this very brief timeline. And as well, just to give you a snapshot of the current situation in the country, here's a graph of the current cases in Canada that was updated yesterday, again, to help contextualize our discussion. As many of you may be aware, the Prime Minister has also been giving regular updates on current actions the government has been taking to address COVID-19 related issues. Now that we have an understanding of the current situation, we are going to speak briefly to the current human rights implications of COVID-19. In this slide, we will be speaking to the Alberta Human Rights Act, but again, we encourage you to visit the website of your own human rights agency if you are joining us from outside of Alberta. A list of all the provincial and territorial human rights agencies can be found on the Canadian Human Rights Commission website as well. So discrimination related to COVID-19 is prohibited when it involves a ground under the Alberta Human Rights Act in areas of service, housing, and employment. Some of these protected grounds are disability, place of origin, and race. The Alberta Human Rights Commission also emphasizes that we know that COVID-19 is not isolated to individuals of any particular race, ethnic origin, or place of origin. We have provided a few examples below of some human rights concerns and questions related to COVID-19. Consider if you believe each of the statements are discriminatory or not discriminatory. So starting from the far left, restrictions based on where a person has recently traveled may be reasonable and not discriminatory. Similarly, many services have restricted hours for seniors or vulnerable individuals, such as grocery stores. This would not be seen as discriminatory to other members of the public. However, under normal circumstances, this could be discriminatory. And finally, on the right, making assumptions about an individual's exposure to COVID-19 based on race, place of origin, or ethnic origin is discriminatory. Other provinces across Canada have issued similar statements or shared resources related to COVID-19 and discrimination. For example, the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission recently released a FAQ sheet on COVID-19. Some of the questions people had were, is my employer allowed to terminate me for having COVID-19? And I am being harassed by my colleague due to a perception in my workplace that I must have COVID-19 due to my race. Is this legal? As well, BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner has released a similar FAQ document, and we encourage you to access these resources if you would like more information. So human rights implications related to COVID-19 is also a growing concern at the national level as well. On April 8th, the Canadian Human Rights Commission released a statement from the Chief Commissioner. I'm going to read out the first two paragraphs of this statement, and while I do, consider the impact of racism and xenophobia on a national scale. The Canadian Human Rights Commission is deeply concerned by the rise of racism across Canada since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Minority groups, in particular people of Asian origin, have been the victims of racist taunts, threats, intimidation in public and online, and physical violence. This is both an issue of public safety and fundamental human rights. No one should feel threatened or unwelcomed because of the color of their skin or where they are from. Although the Human Rights Commission has noted a rise in racism since the COVID-19 pandemic, there is not currently data available on how significantly reports of human rights violations have increased. This concludes our section on COVID-19 and human rights, but again, we encourage you to visit the Canadian Human Rights Commission website for more information. So we are now going to go over some key terms and look at some findings from a recent survey launched by ActionDignity. As I mentioned, these terms will help guide us through the analysis of racism and health later in the webinar. So here are the definitions that we have chosen to share on xenophobia, racism, and racialization. Xenophobia describes attitudes, prejudice, and behaviors that reject, exclude, and often vilify persons based on the perception that they are outsiders or foreigners to the community, society, or national identity. Moving to the right, racism is an individual action or institutional practice backed by institutional power, which subordinates people because of their color or ethnicity. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, racism and xenophobia are distinct phenomena, although they often overlap. While racism generally implies distinction based on differences in physical characteristics such as skin coloration, hair type, facial features, etc., xenophobia denotes behavior specifically based on the perception that the other is foreign to or originates from outside the community or nation. And finally, the definition we have provided for racialization. It is the process through which groups come to be socially constructed as races based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, language, economics, etc. That is treated outside the norm and receiving unequal treatment based on phenotypical features. And the final key definition we would like to share is discrimination. So this definition comes from the CHRC, and that is discrimination is an action or decision that results in unfair or negative treatment of a person or group for reasons such as their race or age. This tweet on the left is from the Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, and was on January 29th. It's part of a larger thread that notes the concerning rise in reports of anti-Asian racism in Canada. This tweet includes a graphic which provides suggestions on how Canadians can help stop the spread of misinformation and bias, including being mindful of the language you use and not using stereotypes. What was especially concerning about this tweet is that many of the replies to this tweet contained discriminatory and racist language directed at Asian Canadians. So before we get into the racism and health section, I'd just like to share some information on, again, a recent survey that ActionDignity has released to better understand how this crisis is affecting individuals and community organizations, and to help build community capacity to respond to the situation. The survey is currently open and a link will be shared with you after the webinar. We are going to share some of the valuable insights we have gained from this survey in the next slide to help inform our discussion, and Tyra will speak more to what we have learned so far later in the webinar. Much of the content in this webinar was actually informed by the responses of this survey by community members. So to summarize, the purpose of this survey is to identify needs, locate gaps, issues, and opportunities for improvement, share positive experiences, and identify actions that are helping communities respond to COVID-19. And on this side, we see a breakdown of some of the key insights. So in total, the number of responses to date has been 117. And on the far left, we see that 71% of respondents thought that it was extremely important for them to have up-to-date COVID-19 information available in their first language. Some of the specific responses are shared below. And in response to this, this number, there have been some resources that are already available. For example, the Calgary Local Immigration Partnership has a website dedicated to multilingual resources, and some of these resources even include YouTube videos. Moving to the right, 65% of respondents thought that websites are the most important way to share information. Other responses included Facebook, emails, and WhatsApp. And finally, 89% of respondents have avoided going into crowded places the last 5 days. Other actions seem to follow current public health recommendations, such as canceling face-to-face meetings or workshops, and utilizing virtual methods of engagement, as we're doing right now. The survey provides us with valuable information on how we share information and in what languages, where we're sharing the information, and steps people are currently taking to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. This is an important tool for understanding how we can engage with and support our communities during this pandemic. We are now going to move on to the next section of the webinar titled Racism and Health, where we will analyze racism, xenophobia, and discrimination related to COVID-19. We will also end this section by sharing some response strategies. So I'm going to hand things off to Tyra to take you through the next section of the webinar.
Thanks, Jayde. So before we get started on the heavy content, I would like to provide a content warning. So a content warning is used to warn attendees of upcoming information that they might find triggering or upsetting. The content warnings for this webinar are: 1, discussion of anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. This will include specific tweets and data on hate incidents. Content warning number 2 is discussion of anti-Black racism and xenophobia. And this will include stats on mass incarceration, video examples of racism, and discussion of medical experimentation. And the third content warning is discussion of anti-Indigenous racism. And this will include stats on mass incarceration, a specific racial threat, and also past experiences with H1N1. And the fourth warning is discussion of incarceration and the carceral state. This will include stats on overrepresentation and also the current outbreaks that are going on in prison. So to start off, This is a drawing by Lisa Woolrim Schablum, a Korean-Swedish artist. The image says, because of this virus, there's a chance that people may say or do mean things to us. So that's assumably a parent speaking to their children. And Schablum has said that the Asian community went from being invisible to being hypervisible, but as a virus or as a carrier of a virus. This hypervisibility is problematic, scary, and has led to the necessity for Asian parents to have these conversations with their children. Because of COVID-19, anti-Asian racism and xenophobia has been highlighted in the media. So here are some examples of the anti-Asian racism that has been going on. So the first source on the left is from Canada. Peter Ackman was a journalist for CTV. He tweeted, "Hopefully all I got today was a haircut," while posting a photo with his Asian barber. Because of the backlash of this tweet, Ackman was let go. But recently there was a poll on straight.com that reported that 70% of respondents think that he should be rehired. And 70% in this situation means 3,348 people. So that's a pretty large amount of people. And the next tweet on the top right is from Donald Trump, President of the United States. And he says, "The United States will be powerfully supporting those industries, like airlines and others, that are particularly affected by the Chinese virus. We will be stronger than ever before." I find this tweet particularly dangerous because of the impact that the President of the United States has on the world globally. This tweet has generated 300,000 likes and 70,000 retweets. And the reach of that is massive. And I believe that this tweet from Trump led to this third tweet. So the final tweet on the bottom right is from Weijia Zhang, CBS News White House correspondent. Zhang tweeted, "This morning, a White House official referred to the coronavirus as the blank." I don't want to say that word, so just read it from the page. "Referred to the coronavirus as the blank to my face. Makes me wonder what they're calling it behind my back." I think it's important to note that this was tweeted the day after Trump's tweet. And the audacity of the President of the United States to say something so blatantly racist has led to the outpouring of White House staff feeling comfortable in perpetuating obvious racism at work. And so unfortunately, Canada doesn't really have stats on the reports of anti-Asian racism as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this source is from the United States. The Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council created a website called Stop AAPI Hate. So that means Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Since their launch on March 19, 2020, the site has received 1,100 reports of COVID-19 related discrimination. The chart on the slide is an analysis of the emerging trends from their first 2 weeks. Of the reported types of discrimination, the most frequent forms are 67.3% reported verbal harassment, 23.5% reported shunning, and 10% reported physical assault. So I find this data very upsetting, and I think it illustrates the impact that anti-Asian racism has had on the daily lives of Asian people. And some more specific examples from the site are perpetrators calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus, a perpetrator spitting on a respondent, and Lyft and Uber drivers canceling on Asian passengers. This relates back to the quote by Shablum, in that all Asian people are assumed to have COVID-19, and this assumption has led to increased anti-Asian language and also has caused individual experiences of violence, hate, and fear. So another form of racism that is being highlighted by the COVID-19 is anti-Black racism. And because Canada doesn't have the data on the racial makeup of people that have died from COVID-19, we'll be taking a source from elsewhere. The above charts are from the United States, and Louisiana is just one example of a state where Black Americans are being disproportionately harmed by COVID-19. The chart on the left shows the racial breakdown of the Louisiana residents that have died from the COVID-19. So far in Louisiana, 70.5% of the COVID-19 victims are Black. The chart on the right is the racial breakdown of the residents of Louisiana. Based on the most recent census, 32.7% of Louisiana residents are Black. The census data in comparison to the data on the left is very telling of the problem that is currently going on in the United States. In addition to this, I would also like to note that 28.6% of the COVID-19 victims have been white, whereas the population of white residents in Louisiana is 58.6%. So there is a clear issue going on in Louisiana, as well as in other states. Black people are dying at disproportionate rates. And another thing to consider is that Black residents are also more likely to have underlying health issues than white residents. This also points to another issue, among many, with the United States healthcare system. So on this slide, we want to show the way that anti-Black racism, and specifically anti-African racism, has been obvious on the global scale. The first video is two French doctors discussing their idea to test a COVID-19 vaccine in Africa. So this video is quite racist and is also extremely horrifying, considering the historical ways that Africans and African Americans have been continuously experimented on. For this video, I want to give a content warning. There is discussion of medical experimentation, and there's also some anti-sex worker dialogue in there. And then the video on the right is a news report from southern China, and it's a discussion of the ways in which Africans in China are being seen as carriers of the second round of COVID-19. So the videos won't automatically play, but if you look to the right of your screen, there should be video links in the handouts. So if you could just open that up yourselves and then watch the videos, and we'll give you about 5 minutes. So that's been about 5 minutes. So I hope that everyone has finished the videos, and if not, you can take a look at them another time. But essentially the first video is, like as I mentioned, two French doctors talking about testing a COVID-19 vaccine on Africans. And then the second video is a news report from southern China, and is showing the treatment of Africans in China at this moment. So a number of Africans have said that they have been kicked out of their homes, not allowed into businesses and hotels, and that local officials have launched a round of mandatory tests for COVID-19, followed by mandatory self-quarantine for anyone with African contacts, regardless of recent travel history or previous quarantine completion. So I haven't yet seen international attention on this issue, but I think that this is a priority to acknowledge. A number of African leaders have spoken out on this, but I haven't seen pressure from non-African leaders. And if this is the current state for Africans in South China, then I think if there is a significant COVID-19 outbreak in Little Africa, then I think the African community will likely be forced to fend for themselves. So I think that the time to increase international political pressure is now. The final form of racism that we want to highlight during this webinar is anti-Indigenous racism. We're going to start off with a specific example of racism and also the weaponization of the pandemic. The headline is Calgary Police Investigate COVID-19 Threats to Local Business, Indigenous Populations. Here's a quote from the article that posted in the beginning of April. In the second case, a man allegedly commented on an Indigenous group's social media page threatening to intentionally spread the virus to Indigenous people, police said. This is a very alarming threat and also speaks to the history of virus weaponization in Canada. This threat is, one, incredibly scary and racist, and two, quite triggering considering the impact that smallpox had on Indigenous people in Canada. I also find it quite alarming considering the fact that Indigenous people may have increased risk to COVID-19. So to look at the risk, we want to look at the institutional racism that will contribute to the effect that COVID-19 may have on Indigenous groups that live on reserve. Here is an excerpt from the Government of Canada's website. This is from their page, Coronavirus and Indigenous Communities. If your community is on a boil water advisory or do not consume advisory, you should still use your water to wash your hands with soap and water and for personal hygiene. Infants and toddlers should be sponge bathed in order to avoid accidentally swallowing the water. If you are on a do not use advisory, your water is not safe for any use. Use bottled water with soap or hand sanitizer with at least 60% alcohol to wash your hands. If you do not have access to running water, wash your hands in a large bowl and then throw out the water from the hand washing bowl after each use. So in connection with this, I want to move on to the other specific challenges that Indigenous peoples that live on reserve will have. So number one is the lack of clean drinking water in some areas. There are several challenges associated with this. One, this makes frequent hand washing impossible. And to note, as of October 2019, there were almost 100 reserves with boil water advisories. And then some homes on reserves do not have running water. Number two, overcrowding in houses. So this makes it basically impossible to effectively self-isolate. Three, distance and the remoteness of some Indigenous communities. There are 96 remote fly-in Indigenous communities across Canada. This leads to issues with accessing medical support and also access to necessary sanitary items like hand sanitizer. This is also challenging because of the necessity to screen for COVID-19 prior to people entering the community. Number four, Indigenous peoples were disproportionately affected by H1N1. According to a study in the Canadian Journal of Public Health, Aboriginal people constitute only 3.8% of Canada's population, yet members of the First Nations were 6.5 times more likely to be admitted to an ICU with H1N1 2009 influenza than non-First Nations, and had rates of hospitalization nearly triple that of the national cumulative crude rate for all Canadians. Because of all the mentioned concerns about Indigenous people's risks to COVID-19, Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, has stated, "A single case in any First Nations, Inuit, or Métis community is high cause for concern. These communities are among the most vulnerable to COVID-19 due to distance, access to necessary resources, and underlying health conditions." I think it is extremely important to focus on the challenges and concerns that Indigenous people living on reserves are having with COVID-19. I think it is also important to make sure that we take future preventative actions so that the risk is never this high again. The final topic we would like to discuss in relation to COVID-19 and health is incarceration. This topic also relates to the previous topics in that Indigenous peoples and Black people are overrepresented within federal prisons. So Indigenous peoples account for 5% of the total Canadian population, and yet account for 30% of the federal incarcerated population. And Black people account for 3.5% of the total Canadian population and account for 7.3% of the federal incarcerated population. It is also good to note that the Black incarcerated population is one of the fastest growing subpopulations in federal corrections. So this overrepresentation is likely to become even more amplified. It is important to understand who is overrepresented in prison, because then they are also at an overrepresented risk for the COVID-19 while incarcerated. So the above in blue are both headlines by CBC. Edmonton Institute inmate punished for speaking to media about COVID-19, lawyer says. And it's horrifying. Physicians and lawyers say coronavirus outbreak at BC prison could have been prevented. These headlines display how COVID-19 has not been effectively managed within Canadian prisons. The headline on the left shows that an inmate has been punished for talking to the media about COVID-19. The inmate, Henry, was concerned about COVID-19 because he has asthma and also takes medication for high blood pressure. This increased his risk to COVID-19. Henry's punishment has included having his phone card suspended for 45 days. And since in-person visits are forbidden, Henry has no way to communicate with anyone outside of prison. I would also like to say that I think Henry has a reason to be concerned. According to data by Correctional Service Canada, there have been 313 total tests in prisons. Out of this 313, 82 have been positive. This means that 26% of total tests have been positive for COVID-19. I think that this speaks for the current situation for inmates and the ways in which the COVID-19 outbreak hasn't been contained. In fact, in one BC prison, there have been 25 inmates confirmed to have COVID-19. I think that the condition of people in prison is a current priority. This is an issue that needs to be addressed by the Canadian government. And I believe that the most effective way to reduce the spread of COVID-19 in prisons is to reduce the prison population. I think that low-risk offenders should be released from prison and temporarily housed somewhere else. Now this finishes up this part of the presentation. And before we move on, I just want to note that there's only so much we can do in 2 hours. And there is a lot of connections that can be made with the COVID-19 pandemic. I believe that it's highlighted a lot of issues that people are currently facing in society. So this isn't meant to be completely comprehensive, and it's rather meant to share information that can help people to feel aware enough to act. And so now we're going to move into the more actionable section.
Thanks, Tyra. So we would like to end this section on racism and health with a few strategies that you can use to respond to racism and xenophobia. This is a 5-step response strategy that has been adapted from teachingtolerance.org. There are other resources and documents that have various tips and resources when responding to racism and xenophobia. This is just one that we've chosen to share for the purpose of this webinar. So during this pandemic, we've been seeing an increase in racism and discrimination, and it's really important that we do not brush off this type of language or behavior. As Tyra mentioned, the purpose of the webinar is to share information and increase your awareness and knowledge so that we can begin to respond to harmful acts and language. So I'm going to go through this 5-step strategy. The first step is recognizing comments in the media that have racist or xenophobic bias. The second step is to interrupt, and interrupting shows the person that you're talking with that what they've said is important enough for you to pause your conversation and address. It is important to talk about the racism before you talk about anything else. The third step is to question, and the goal of questioning is really to better understand why the person said what they did. The fourth step is educate. And from this resource, they state that the goal of educate is not just to provide facts on the topic, but to explain why what they've said needs rethinking. So to educate someone on racism associated with COVID-19, we need to understand not only the virus, but also the racism. And the final step is to echo. When someone else speaks up on racist behaviors, echo them or thank them. You can emphasize or amplify their message in any way that you can or feel comfortable doing. So if we look at one of the examples that Tyra had shared earlier of the US president calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus, here are some suggestions on how we might respond. So the first would be recognizing that this is discriminatory and racist language. Next, to interrupt, you might say, hang on, I want to go back to what you've called the virus. Questioning might be asking, why did you call the virus that? Or where did you hear this information? And educate would involve informing yourself on the history and harm of associating diseases with specific places or groups of people from a region. In a recent article titled "The Life and Death Consequences of Naming the Coronavirus," the author of this article provides various examples in history where diseases are named after places, such as the Ebola River, Lyme, Connecticut, the Zika forest, that can unfairly associate a place or a people from that region with an illness. And finally, the last step would be to echo if you were observing someone else who is calling out this type of behavior, either amplifying that message or thanking them, because we all need to work together to solve some of these complex issues. Again, I also wanted to mention a few other tips and strategies that we have come across as we've been doing the research. The Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants also has a great online resources with tips and strategies to counter racism and prejudice during the COVID-19 pandemic. So these tips include posting in public spaces, preventative hygiene practices like hand washing, hosting brainstorming sessions with your staff or team on how to respond to clients who voice concerns about their health, reviewing your anti-oppression policy and implementation plan, and developing key responses to comments from colleagues, clients, vendors, or others that are xenophobic and racist. And finally, sharing articles or other educational resources about the virus that are factual, counteract the evolving anti-Asian narrative. So again, these are just a few tips and strategies you might be able to adapt or implement in your day-to-day life. But we again encourage you to look for resources available on the internet. And to continue with some of the tangible actions that we've addressed throughout this webinar, they can both be observed at the individual and the institutional level. These are challenging racism and xenophobia online, as per our previous slide. If in person, assess whether it is possible to safely engage at a distance. Pressuring political leaders to address the anti-African racism currently happening in China. Currently, only African leaders have spoken out about this. The individual level, this could be in the form of donating or educating others on the anti-Asian racism and xenophobia that has been amplified because of COVID-19. And at the institutional level, this would involve preparing for the likelihood of more COVID-19 outbreaks in prison and future preventative actions to protect Indigenous peoples living on reserve. So this wraps up our racism and health section. Now we would like to focus on self-care and community care during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that this is a very challenging time for everyone, and we want to offer some information both on how other communities have been feeling and some strategies to cope during this difficult time. So first, to begin, we're going to start this section with another poll to allow you each to reflect on how you're feeling at this time and what activities or interactions you've been having. We'll give you a few minutes, but the poll should pop up on your screen. The first will be, how many times are you having physical activity each week? The second is, how many times per week are you having significant social interaction? And the third is, how have you been impacted emotionally by COVID-19? There we go. So it looks like the majority of responses are more than once a week, people are having physical activity. That can be a great tool to support mental and physical well-being, but again, other people might prefer different tools and strategies. So thank you all for your responses, and we'll move on to the second poll question. So again, looks like similar numbers. Some people, or most respondents, sorry, have been having significant social interaction more than once a week. Again, this is something that a tip and strategy is connecting with others or using different forms to maintain some of those social interactions as we navigate this challenging time. So thank you again, and we'll move on to the final poll. Great. Thank you, everybody, for your responses. It can be challenging to reflect on some of these emotions that we've all been feeling during this time. And really, the purpose of doing this poll was almost as if a quick self-assessment for yourself as we move into some tips and strategies, and also look at what other communities are saying. Because one thing we really want to emphasize in this section is that we're not alone. So thank you all, and we'll get back to the slides. All right, so here are some of the responses that we've received from the survey that ActionDignity sent out to community members. So some of these responses have been people feeling overwhelmed with fear affecting their mental and interpersonal relationships. Some who are already isolated become even more isolated. There are also concerns for those who are experiencing domestic violence. Without support and the ability to leave the house, these numbers will likely increase, as well as concerns related to mental and emotional well-being and establishing a healthy and productive routine. Some people also mention that this is their first year in Canada and that they feel very scared and isolated. So some of the responses in the survey have been similar to that which was shared in the poll questions, and can be very alarming, but we do want to briefly talk about some of the concerns and impacts of these complex emotions before we move into some tips and strategies for all of us. So based on the previous slide, the main concerns that people have are isolation, fear, economic instability, trauma, inability to leave the house. And it's important that we also discuss the long-term impacts that these can have on ourselves. So impacts could include anxiety and depression, hopelessness, stress, loss of control, as well as kids being unable to focus during school online. Kids can also, this can cause stress in these situations where it has the potential to impact how effective they can be at school, as well as increased rates of domestic violence. And to note, this is something that ActionDignity is currently working to address through their North Star program. And we've shared a quote at the bottom of the screen with you that is, it states, "When I is replaced with we, even illness becomes wellness." And this, Malcolm X had said this. We wanted to share this quote because it highlights the importance of the collective. These seem like individual issues, but are also solved by connecting with others. And finally, I'd like to just take a moment to say, if you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help or support. There we go. And I'll hand things back off to Tyra.
Thanks, Jayde. So based on the information and concerns that people listed in the survey that ActionDignity sent out, we compiled a resource guide on COVID-19 related information. So this addressed most of the concerns and impacts that were listed on the previous slide. So this resource guide is to support the sharing of reliable information. So this would be through trusted sources and in multiple languages, and through mediums that are easy to share on social media. So infographics, tip sheets, posters, videos, and also organized around themes that communities want. And this is also to help communities raise awareness of supports that they can provide, and also to share inspiring stories of community action, because we know that the media can be quite harmful during this time. So it's also important to focus on the ways in which people are coming together, though not physically, but people are becoming emotionally connected through their advocacy, and also through reaching out to people on an emotional level. So the resource guide provides information on mental health during COVID-19, tips for connecting with others, information on preventing COVID-19 spread, government assistance and support with basic needs, and also information on funding opportunities. The link is on the page and is also available on the ActionDignity website. And so I also wanted to move into a couple strategies that people can use to help cope during COVID-19. So this is separated into 4 sections: mind, body, emotional, and social. And so starting off with mind, so if people are working, it's really important to still have a work-life balance, because I know without any other obligations, people can become overwhelmed with work and essentially start working 24/7. I know in the survey, in the poll we had, a lot of people mentioned that they feel overwhelmed with work responsibilities. So I advise that it's still really important to try to incorporate that balance and also separate weekends from weekdays. And also incorporate travel time into your day. And so an example of this would be if each morning you would spend an hour driving to work, and on that hour you would listen to your favorite podcast or you would listen to music. I think it's still important to incorporate that into your day, just because that is an important self-care routine. So maybe listen to a podcast for an hour before you start working, and listen to music after you start working to kind of differentiate between the work day and like your life day. And it's also very important to have a creative outlet and continue to work on any hobbies that you have. For body, it's important to eat well. So still try to incorporate some healthy food into your diet if possible. And also work out and go for a walk. And just try to have some physical exercise because that's a really important aspect of self-care. And for the emotional, I think it's very important to find time to grieve during this period, just because it's a very rough time to be in. I think it's also important to research online therapy if that's something you're comfortable with, to open up to friends about how you're feeling, and also practice mindfulness. And if there is any sort of support that you need, I would advise doing research and finding organizations that can help you in advance. So an example of this is the ActionDignity resource guide. And also find online communities where you can fill a need that you have during this time. And I also want to mention that it's also not good to blame yourself if you're unable to do any of these, because this is a challenging time and it's hard to just keep going as normal. And for the social needs, it's also important to continue to connect with people, and also to make sure to mute social media when you need to, because the news is quite hard to watch all the time. So I would advise taking breaks as needed. And finally, I would like to highlight a quote by Audre Lorde. "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." This quote is included in a design by Alice and Rachel from their book, Recipes for Self-Love. I actually have this book. I would really recommend it. So I personally really like this quote, and I think it is very beautiful at this time. We're in a traumatic situation because of COVID-19, and because it is a threat to everyone's livelihood. The world as we know it has shifted so much, and it's not clear what form everything will take once this pandemic is over. So I just want to acknowledge that we're in a difficult time, and that because of that, people can't proceed in life as if everything is normal, because it's not. We are living in an uncertain time where trauma and collective loss is being amplified. And I believe that right now, everyone needs to take time to care for themselves. And we need to take time to grieve for everyone and everything that we have lost. And that taking that time is just as important as taking political action.
Now, the final section of the webinar, we're going to have one last poll and then open it up for questions. So If you have any questions, I was just typing them in the chat box now so that we can get to them all once we open the space up. And so after the questions, we're also going to conclude with a few resources that we are sharing and a few closing thoughts. So before we get to any of that, one thing we wanted to incorporate in this webinar is a self-care activity. As Tyra mentioned, it is a lot of heavy content, and we wanted to just collectively take a moment to ground ourselves. So this is a activity that I really liked. It's a quick mindfulness activity. It doesn't take very long, so you can either follow along. I'll guide you through the first few steps, or you can just sit where you're at and either take a few deep breaths or reflect on your day, how your morning is going. So to start, each person should stretch out your hands so that you have spaces in between your fingers. And what you're going to do is hold up your pointer finger of your opposite hand and put it at the base of your thumb. So once you've got your finger on your thumb, you're going to use your pointer finger to trace up your thumb as slowly as you can while breathing in through your mouth. And once you get to the top of your thumb, slowly breathe out your nose and trace down to the other side. So it should really match the speed that you're tracing up your fingers. And so you're going to repeat this for all your fingers until you've traced your whole hand and ended on your pinky finger. So I'll just give you a few minutes to do that, and I'm going to mute myself, so you'll have about 2 minutes or so. All right, I hope that tool will be helpful for you, and we encourage you to share other mindfulness tips and strategies with your friends and family. And there's some really great resources on the internet with quick mindfulness activities that we can all incorporate into our days. So before we get to the questions, we just want to end off with a quick poll to assess where everybody's at. And again, it will help us in future presentations and advocacy on this type of work and issues surrounding racism and xenophobia related to COVID-19. So the first question that should pop up on your screen is, do you plan to use any of the mental health tips and strategies shared in this webinar? Or are you already incorporating mental health strategies and resources into your day? So I'll give you a couple minutes for that. All right, well, it's great to hear that people are incorporating these types of tips and strategies into your day-to-day life, and we'll be sure to look for other ways or strategies that we can share. And the second poll question that you should have up on your screen is, do you plan to use or have you already been using any of the racism?
Sorry, Jayde, just wanted to jump in. That was the last poll question we had loaded up in the platform.
Oh, okay. All right, well, we had 2 more questions, but we'll be sure that we're either sharing those on our feedback form or connecting afterwards. So thanks, Con. Okay, so if we go back to this slide, I think we've got a page now where we can open it up to questions. Con, I think we still might be on the poll section. I don't know if that's just my screen. There we go. All right, so I'm going to pass it back over to Tyra quickly. I know she's been monitoring the questions. Tyra, do you have any you want to share?
Yes, thanks, Jayde. So some of the questions that we got are related to the lack of data from Alberta and Canada. And also a question if we are planning to organize action groups to help address the racism in Alberta or the various provinces in Canada. So as a result of the analysis that we had on racism and xenophobia related to the COVID-19, and also noticing the lack of data in Canada, we have launched a survey monkey so that we can kind of get an assessment of how many incidents are occurring and where they're occurring, and also what kind of form that they're taking. And in that, we have added an option for people to suggest actions that we can take to reduce the spread of racism and xenophobia related to the COVID-19. So we will be sending that out after this presentation. And there's also another question that is saying that the link to the ActionDignity community resource package isn't working. So I messaged the person who's in charge of our website, and that should be fixed, and I'll be sending out the new link as well.
And so another question that we received is, what do we know about racism happening in the hospitals? Are people of color being discriminated in treatment situations? So I think this is a really great question, and I don't believe that there is currently any data in Alberta that I am aware of. Tyra, are you aware of any information on that topic?
No, I don't. I don't know of anything, but also that will be included as an option as place of discrimination in the survey.
It's also, I think, highlighting these types of challenging questions are good to talk with your friends, family, colleagues, so that we can hopefully advocate for more data or transparency of any instances that are happening in hospitals. Tyra, do you want to pull out another question?
Yes, I'm just looking through right now. So there is another question on, is there funding support available for community groups to take anti-racism action? So I think this is something that is continuously changing, especially as the needs for anti-racism related to COVID-19 is continued to be highlighted. So there are some resources related to this in the resource package that ActionDignity compiled, and we are making sure to continuously update that as we hear of more funding opportunities.
I am also seeing a few questions about sharing the presentations and some of the studies that we referenced. So at the end of the presentation, we do have a reference page with all of the references for any studies that were mentioned in this presentation. So those will be available. We will also, when we send the follow-up email with the feedback survey, we'll just make sure if we're able to share the PowerPoint presentation with everybody, but it will be available, the recording will be available on AAISA's YouTube page. And just another question to address as well. There was one that asked, will there be a certificate of completion or attendance provided? So not for this webinar. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this webinar is part of a larger anti-discrimination series with some full day workshops that we can share information on. So if you're looking for some professional development training through AAISA, that's available as well.
So I also want to just let everyone know that the link is now working and that those resources are available on the ActionDignity site. And I also see some, I also want to discuss the third survey, or sorry, third poll question that we were going to have, in that we understand that this is such a complicated topic and that it does need more than 2 hours. And if enough people are interested, or we would like to know if people would be interested in having a part 2 of this presentation so that we're able to tackle more issues with an additional 2 hours.
So I just saw another question come in. Tyra, I'm not sure if you're able to answer this, but which African leaders responded to what is happening in China with regards to the racism related to COVID-19? I'm not sure if you have that off the top of your head, but if not, that's another thing that we can also send in our follow-up.
I don't have that off the top of my head, but it is a lot actually. There has been like a number of African leaders from different countries that have spoken out about it.
So to the person asking that question, we'll make sure to send a link to that information so that your question can get answered. Tyra, is there any other question that you would like to highlight at this point?
I'll just take a look.
These are all really great questions.
So already, like, a lot of people are sharing some resources. So it would be great for us to compile these when we also send out our references.
There was another comment as well, question that asked, is the Asian community doing something to reduce the anti-racism situation? So there have been various community-based organizations and community groups that are launching campaigns to raise awareness on this issue, and also providing information on what their communities do if they are a victim of discrimination or racism in these situations. So one in particular I'm thinking of is one in Montreal that has been releasing frequent press releases on what community members can do and where they can seek support. So, but definitely I think something that we all need to advocate for is the existence of anti-Asian racism in response to COVID.
And I have a question here about what was the name of the book that I mentioned. So that is Recipes for Self-Love, and that's by Allison Rachel. And I also want to mention a portal that ActionDignity is creating. So we're creating a website called the SHARP portal. So this is the Shared Anti-Racism portal. That is to compile anti-racism related events and resources across Alberta. So I just wanted to plug that. And this will be launched sometime in May. And so we have a question about expanding the survey to other areas. So the survey about incidents of racism and xenophobia related to COVID-19 will be Canada-wide.
There's also a comment, many vulnerable populations have no access to computers or are not familiar with technology. This limits their access to resources and supports. Absolutely, I think that's a huge issue that we need to collectively address, and especially with frontline workers who are still providing supports and being that line of communication. But other things like resources, like visual resources, as the Ontario Council had mentioned, being able to promote information and resources through visual posters or in gathering spaces can also be helpful. And another question too, will the rest of the trainings / webinars be shared via email? I believe we can share a link via email, but on the last slide of the presentation, we have information on where you can go to get up to date on registration and dates for these upcoming webinars and trainings. It will be found under the professional development section on the AAISA website. So we'll share that website as well.
I'm seeing a comment that says a part 2/update would rock. So I personally like this one. Oh, apparently there were many such comments. So my ego boost has been achieved.
So another question was also, what can we do at the community level to combat COVID-19 racism with little funding? Personally, I think this would be a fantastic topic to discuss further, whether that's, again, in a webinar format or sharing some resources. I think having those supports or places you can go to help combat this type of racism on the community level can be helpful. But yeah, off the top of my mind, I can't think of a specific place to go, but probably part of a larger discussion to see what other communities have been doing and things like that.
And I also see a question, will the full results of the survey be shared to participants? So yes, we will be, based on the information that we get from the survey, we will be creating a report, and then that will be shared.
And oh, another comment as well, the director of the World Health Organization has responded to the racism to Africans in China as a aside. And somebody else had wrote, can you email us the links and book suggestions you are receiving? Yes, we can compile a short document with that.
And the name of action, we have a question. What is the name of the domestic violence program? So that is the North Star program, and that's through ActionDignity.
Another question as well, somebody asking if there has been any support or education targeting children or youth affected by racism during the pandemic. So to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any specific campaigns that are targeting children and youth. Tyra, are you aware of any?
Not off the top of my head, no. ActionDignity has some youth programming, so I'm sure that this is something that we could discuss as well. This is a priority. And I also do just want to mention that we actually have two domestic violence programs. So one is North Star, and one is Sustaining Healthy and Awesome Relationships. So that is the SHARE program.
Another person notes, collecting stories, videos from those who have experienced racism during COVID-19 may be helpful if people are comfortable doing this, as it puts a human face to the issue and hopefully encourages empathy. I think that's a great comment. Somebody else mentioned, since we are at home and doing our best to self-isolate, are you mostly referring to racist attitudes and actions via social media? There has been, I think, more instances of racism and xenophobia online, but again, these instances can also happen at the grocery store, in the media, as Tyra had shared, and even talking with your friends and your family. You know, it's important to educate and amplify the importance of this issue as well.
Yeah, and as one of the comments mentioned, I would just like to reference like a Canadian example of like in-person violence caused by racism and xenophobia. So there was an attack in Montreal in which a Korean man was assaulted because of these racist and xenophobic attitudes and assumptions about COVID-19.
And somebody else had sent out another question about, can you send out updates via email about government supports and community supports? So I believe AAISA has been sending out their weekly COVID-19 update. So I would suggest going onto their website and signing up for the newsletter to get information on that, and as well to add to another question about financial supports for organizations to promote anti-racism during COVID-19. There aren't any financial supports that I am aware of, but again, connecting with AAISA is a great resource. For our organization, the Alberta Rural Development Network, we have been sending out information on funding and supports via our newsletter as well. And we'll also be updating people periodically as we also work in rural homelessness, supporting vulnerable populations in outside of our 7 largest cities in Alberta.
And we just got a good question about the intersection of policing in this. So as ticketing for not social distancing is being implemented in urban centers, is there data regarding discrimination in policing? I think that's actually a very good point, and that's something I overlooked in creating the SurveyMonkey. So that's definitely a category I'm going to add.
I think we have time for maybe one last question before we do our wrap up. Is there anyone you would like to share, Tyra?
Let me take a look. There's 8 pages of questions here, everyone.
And thank you all for sharing your questions as well. If we didn't get to any of them, we can revisit afterwards and hopefully see if we can provide some resources or responses to any of the questions that are left, unanswered.
There's one that I see that says, can ActionDignity or others host a planning session on community actions? And I think that's a really good idea. And I think that is something that is likely, because that that is a role that we would have anyways, but now we would just have to transition to like an online form. So I think that that's very possible. And also, we recently had an online community forum that displayed information on the actions we've been taking since the outbreak of COVID-19, and also to disseminate the results of the survey that ActionDignity sent out. So I'm sure that we can have another one.
And to speak to that question as well, we have been working closely with rural communities in Alberta to understand what the current needs are, emerging needs and gaps are, so that we can help and support our smaller communities who, again, may experience lack of resources, lack of funding, challenges with distance. So yeah, we're following a similar suit. So again, thank you everybody for your questions and comments. They have been fantastic to read, and we've been having a fun time trying to keep up with all of them. So we're going to now start to wrap up the webinar. In the next slide here, you will see both my contact information and Tyra's contact information. We encourage you to reach out if you would like. Again, our websites are shared as well if you would like to learn more about ActionDignity or the Alberta Rural Development Network and some of the work that we're doing during the pandemic. Do you have anything to add on that, Tyra?
No, I just want to say that I have really enjoyed this session, and that I am liking the engagement from participants in the comments, and it makes me quite excited about all of the work that we can do together in the future to kind of challenge some of this.
All right, and as a final slide, we want to thank everybody so much for attending this webinar. We were very humbled by the amount of interest that it had received, even from outside of Alberta, and hopefully you can access information in your respective provinces and territories that we weren't able to provide. As I mentioned, this is part of a webinar series on anti-discrimination topics, the partnership between ActionDignity, AAISA, and ARDN. So if you would like more information on upcoming dates and registrations, please visit the professional development page on AAISA's website. So it can be found at the bottom of the screen here, and we'll be sure to to send that as well with our feedback form. And the last slide here, I'm gonna pass it over to Tyra just to speak a little bit about the poll.
Thanks, Jayde. So yeah, here's the survey. So this is launching like right now. So this will hopefully help us to get an assessment on what the situation is in Canada, and then help us to create a response based on this. So this survey is Canada-wide, and in it we will ask people to, if they have seen, heard, or experienced any incidents of racism or xenophobia related to COVID-19. And then through this we can get some more information on where this occurred, what kind of discrimination occurred, what was the person's role in the situation, and also if the situation was resolved, and also if anyone has any suggestions for actions that we can take to combat COVID-19 related racism and xenophobia.
Thanks, Tyra. And I think as well the ways in which communities have been mobilizing, especially with some of the restrictions and all of us being at home social distancing has been amazing to see, and I think will be hugely impactful because when we're all working together, it can have a really big impact. So thank you all again. We're going to leave up the last slide, which has information on some of the resources and articles that we've used in this presentation. Again, you should be receiving a link to a feedback form in the next couple days. And we'd love if we could receive any of your feedback or thoughts, as it will help us help inform and improve future webinars and workshops. So yeah, Tyra, do you have anything to add?
No, nothing to add.
And anything from our AMSSA or AAISA team? All right, hearing nothing. I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day and you're all staying healthy and well. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.